Have you ever noticed how the loudest person in the room is often the most insecure? How the one who argues the most desperately is usually the one who believes the least in their own convictions? They raise their voices, throw facts around like weapons, demand that you see their point. But what if I told you that according to Friedrich Nietzsche, this desperate need to argue reveals something much darker about human nature? What if the very act of arguing is not a sign of strength, but a confession of weakness? Think about the last heated argument you witnessed. Maybe it was on social media, maybe at work, maybe even in your own home. Now ask yourself this: was the person arguing really trying to discover truth? Or were they trying to prove something to themselves? Were they seeking understanding? Or were they seeking validation? Nietzsche saw through this game long before the age of Twitter debates and comment section wars. He understood that most arguments are not about ideas at all. They are about something much more primitive, the desperate need to feel powerful when you feel powerless inside. And that's where we begin to understand why arguing is for weak people. Because when you truly know who you are, when you are secure in your own values and beliefs, you don't need the world to agree with you. You don't need to convert everyone to your way of thinking. You don't need to win every intellectual battle to sleep peacefully at night. But let me take you deeper into this rabbit hole, because what Nietzsche discovered about human nature will make you question every argument you've ever had. You see, Nietzsche had a term for this phenomenon. He called it ressentiment. Not just resentment, but something more toxic, more consuming. It's the burning need to tear down others because you cannot build yourself up. It's the compulsion to argue not because you love truth, but because you hate feeling small. When someone attacks your ideas with unusual vehemence, when they seem personally offended by your different perspective, when they cannot simply disagree and move on, you are witnessing ressentiment in action. They are not really arguing with you. They are arguing with their own insecurities, their own doubts, their own fear that maybe, just maybe, they don't know as much as they pretend to know. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to argue with certain people? How they seem to drain your energy, pull you into their chaos, make you feel like you're fighting for your very identity? That's because you are, but not in the way you think. You are fighting against their need to use you as a mirror for their own validation. Every time you engage, every time you defend, every time you try to explain yourself, you are feeding their hunger for significance. You are giving them what Nietzsche would call slave morality, the need to define themselves in opposition to others rather than from their own inner strength. And here's the cruel irony. The more you argue with these people, the weaker you become, because you start to depend on winning the argument to feel good about yourself. You start to need their agreement to validate your own beliefs. You become exactly what you were fighting against, someone who needs external approval to feel internally strong. But what does a truly strong person do? What does someone who has transcended this need for constant validation look like in daily life? This brings us to one of Nietzsche's most revolutionary ideas, the concept of the Übermensch, the person who has moved beyond the need for external validation. Not a superhuman, but someone who has learned to create their own values rather than defending inherited ones. The strong person doesn't argue because they don't need to prove anything. They share their ideas when asked. They express their views when appropriate, but they don't chase people down to convert them. They don't feel personally attacked when someone disagrees with them. They don't lose sleep over what strangers on the internet think about their opinions. Why? Because their sense of self doesn't depend on being right in the eyes of others. It depends on being authentic to themselves. I want you to think about someone you deeply respect. Really think about them. Do they argue constantly? Do they feel the need to have the last word in every discussion? Do they get visibly upset when people don't immediately agree with their perspective? Probably not. Because true strength is magnetic, not argumentative. It attracts rather than attacks. It influences through presence, not through pressure. The strong person understands what Nietzsche meant when he said we must go beyond good and evil. This doesn't mean becoming immoral. It means transcending the childish need to categorize everything and everyone as either completely right or completely wrong. When you're trapped in constant arguing, you're trapped in binary thinking. Everything is black or white, good or bad, right or wrong. But life is more complex than that. People are more complex than that. Ideas are more complex than that. The person who has moved beyond this binary trap can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. They can see truth in opposing viewpoints. They can disagree without demonizing. They can be wrong without their entire identity crumbling. But most importantly, they can choose their battles. Not because they're afraid of conflict, but because they understand that their energy is precious and finite. And this brings us to perhaps the most practical insight from Nietzsche's philosophy, the art of selective engagement. Every argument you enter, every debate you engage in, every time you feel compelled to defend your position costs you something. It costs you time, energy, peace of mind. And the question you must ask yourself is, what am I getting in return? If you're arguing with someone who is genuinely curious, someone who wants to understand different perspectives, someone who is willing to be changed by new information, then the exchange might be worthwhile. But if you're arguing with someone who just wants to be right, who sees every disagreement as a personal attack, who measures their worth by how many people they can convince, then you're wasting your most precious resource, your attention. The weak person argues with everyone because they haven't learned to discriminate. They react to every provocation, engage with every criticism, feel obligated to defend every belief. They live in a constant state of reactivity, always responding to someone else's agenda rather than pursuing their own. But the strong person has learned something that changes everything. Silence can be more powerful than any argument. When you stop engaging with every provocation, when you stop feeling the need to defend yourself against every criticism, when you stop trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced, something magical happens. You reclaim your power. You stop being controlled by other people's need for drama. You stop being manipulated by those who know exactly which buttons to push to get you riled up. You stop giving your energy to people who will never appreciate it anyway. And here's what Nietzsche understood that most people miss. Your silence disturbs them more than any argument ever could. Because when you refuse to play their game, when you don't take their bait, when you remain calm in the face of their provocations, you force them to confront something they've been avoiding, themselves. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects their own inner chaos back to them, and that makes them deeply uncomfortable. They will try harder to provoke you. They will accuse you of being arrogant, of thinking you're better than them, of not caring about important issues. But what they're really saying is, please engage with me so I can avoid looking at my own insecurities. And your continued silence, your refusal to be drawn into their drama, is the most generous thing you can do for them. Because maybe, just maybe, in that silence, they might finally hear their own voice. They might finally confront their own fears. They might finally start the journey toward becoming strong themselves. This is what Nietzsche called the process of becoming who you really are. Not who others expect you to be, not who you think you should be to fit in, but who you authentically are when no one is watching, when no one is judging, when no one needs you to be anything other than yourself. And that process requires solitude. It requires stepping away from the noise of constant debate and argument. It requires the courage to be misunderstood, to be called names, to be accused of not caring. Because the alternative is to remain trapped in the exhausting cycle of trying to prove yourself to people who will never be satisfied with any proof you offer. So I ask you now, how much of your precious life energy are you spending on arguments that change nothing? How much of your peace are you sacrificing to people who mistake loudness for truth? How much of yourself are you losing in the desperate attempt to be understood by those who have no interest in understanding? Maybe it's time to stop arguing and start living. Maybe it's time to stop trying to convince the world and start convincing yourself that you are enough exactly as you are without needing anyone else's approval or agreement. Because when you truly know who you are, when you are secure in your own values and vision, you don't need to argue. You simply exist. And that existence, that authentic presence, speaks louder than any argument ever could. The weak argue because they must. The strong choose silence because they can. Which one will you be?